August 15, 1945. The air over Tokyo carried ash, and the ghost of smoke from 1,000 fires now extinguished. In the suburbs south of the capital, where wooden structures leaned weary against the weight of defeat, the women gathered in silence. They wore the faded remnants of civilian clothing, blouses with missing buttons, skirts stained by factory oil, shoes held together with wire and desperation. Their hands calloused and scarred from months of assembling munitions in underground workshops, trembled not from exhaustion, but from a terror more primal than any they had known during the war itself. The Emperor's voice had crackled through damaged radios hours earlier, speaking words they had been conditioned since childhood never to imagine: surrender, unconditional, absolute. And with that single broadcast, the world these women understood, the world of divine empire and inevitable victory, collapsed into a void filled only with rumor and dread. They had heard the stories whispered in the darkness of factory dormitories and air raid shelters. Stories of what happened to women when cities fell. Stories from Nanping, from Manila, from a dozen conquered territories where the victorious had claimed their prizes in flesh and terror. The propaganda newsreels had shown all of Japan what the militarists claimed awaited those who surrendered to the barbaric West: violation, enslavement, extermination. Now, as American occupation forces approached, these women believed with the certainty of religious conviction that they faced not liberation, but annihilation. Some clutched small vials of poison distributed by desperate officers in the war's final weeks. Others simply held each other, trying to find courage in numbers as they awaited the conquerors they had been taught to fear more than death itself. The first American military vehicles rolled through the shattered streets 3 days later. Jeeps bearing white stars, trucks filled with soldiers whose faces showed not the demonic features of propaganda posters but the weary relief of young men who had survived. The women who remained in Tokyo, those who had not fled to the countryside or taken their own lives in the days following surrender, watched from behind broken windows and beneath doorways, their bodies rigid with anticipation of horrors to come. Among those watching were the factory workers, the office clerks, the teachers and students who had been mobilized into Japan's total war effort. Women who had bent metal in aircraft plants, who had sorted supplies in military depots, who had transmitted communications in government offices. Women who, under the rigid classifications of military law, might now be considered enemies of the occupying power. Prisoners of war in all but formal designation. The American command faced an unprecedented challenge. Unlike the European theater, where military and civilian populations could be relatively easily distinguished, Japan's home front had been utterly militarized in the war's final year. Women had been conscripted into quasi-military service through the volunteer labor corps, the Women's Defense Association, and dozens of other organizations that blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Tens of thousands had worked in direct support of military operations. Thousands more had received rudimentary military training, had been prepared to fight with bamboo spears and suicide charges when the anticipated American invasion reached Japanese soil. Now, with occupation rather than invasion, the question of how to classify, process, and manage these women presented both logistical and moral complexities that standard prisoner of war protocols had never been designed to address. In the bureaucratic machinery of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, decisions were being made that would determine the fate of thousands. Initial directives called for the registration and monitoring of all individuals who had served in military or quasi-military capacities. Processing centers were established in schools, temples, and commandeered government buildings across the occupied territories. Women who had worked in military industries were ordered to report for registration, documentation, and classification. The term prisoner of war was carefully avoided in official communications, too inflammatory, too likely to trigger mass panic or resistance. Instead, they were to be called detainees, registrants, or simply former military workers. But the women themselves understood the reality beneath the euphemism. They were being rounded up. They were being taken into custody. And they believed, with a conviction born from years of propaganda, that they would not emerge alive. The facility, established on the outskirts of Yokohama, had once been a girls' boarding school. Its wooden buildings, scarred by nearby bomb strikes but still structurally sound, were hastily converted into a processing center for female detainees from the Tokyo-Yokohama Industrial Zone. Barbed wire was strung around the perimeter, not to prevent escape, as military planners understood, but to prevent mobs from attempting to reach those inside. Japanese society, traumatized and disoriented, was fracturing along unpredictable lines. Some civilians blamed military personnel for the catastrophic defeat and might seek violent retribution. Others remained fanatically loyal to the fallen empire and might attempt to rescue detainees or encourage mass suicide rather than submission to the enemy. The wire was as much protection as imprisonment. On August 29, 1945, the first group of women was processed through the gates of the Yokohama facility. They arrived in military trucks, packed so tightly that some had stood throughout the hour-long journey from Tokyo. Their faces were masks of controlled terror, the Japanese discipline of suppressing outward emotion stretched to its breaking point. They had said goodbye to their families that morning, many certain they would never see them again. Mothers had whispered final words to daughters. Sisters had held each other with the desperate grip of the condemned. Some had dressed in their finest remaining clothes, determined to face death with dignity. Others wore whatever rags they possessed, having abandoned any concern for appearance, in the face of inevitable doom. As they were ordered down from the trucks and lined up in the facility's courtyard, their eyes darted frantically, trying to assess what awaited them. The buildings showed no obvious signs of execution or torture, but they knew the stories, knew that the worst atrocities often happened in ordinary places, made extraordinary by human cruelty. American soldiers stood at intervals around the courtyard, young men in uniform whose faces ranged from bored indifference to obvious discomfort at the task before them. These soldiers, many of whom had fought through the Pacific Islands and witnessed the fanaticism of Japanese military resistance, now faced an enemy that looked nothing like what they had been trained to fight. These were not suicide-charging soldiers or kamikaze pilots. These were women who looked like their own sisters, mothers, and wives, exhausted, frightened, and utterly defeated. The American military command had recognized early that the processing and supervision of female detainees required personnel who could navigate both the practical and psychological challenges of the situation. Traditional military police units, composed entirely of combat-experienced male soldiers, were deemed inappropriate for managing facilities housing women. The solution came through a hastily expanded program, the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. These uniformed women, who had served primarily in administrative, communications, and medical roles during the war, were now being deployed to occupy Japan with a new and unprecedented mission. They would serve as guards, administrators, and the primary interface between the occupation authority and Japanese women swept up in the post-surrender chaos. Among those deployed to the Yokohama facility was First Lieutenant Margaret Ellen Hastings, a 31-year-old WSC officer from rural Pennsylvania. Hastings had joined the Women's Army Corps in 1943, serving initially as a supply coordinator at bases in California before volunteering for overseas deployment in early 1945. She had arrived in the Pacific Theater just weeks before Japan's surrender, expecting to support the logistics of a massive invasion. Instead, she found herself assigned to occupation duty and given command of a detainee processing unit, a role for which her training had provided no preparation whatsoever. What she did possess, however, was something that would prove far more valuable than military doctrine: a fundamental decency, and an inability to see enemies where she saw only frightened human beings. Lieutenant Hastings stood in the facility's main hall as the first group of detainees was brought inside for processing. The women filed in silently, their eyes fixed on the floor, their bodies tensed as if expecting blows. They were directed to sit on benches arranged in rows, waiting their turn to be called forward for documentation. The process was bureaucratic and mundane: name, age, place of birth, work history, organizational affiliations. But to the women enduring it, every question felt like an interrogation designed to justify their execution. When asked about their work in military factories, many answered in barely audible whispers, as if speaking too clearly might accelerate their fate. Some wept silently, tears streaming down faces they struggled to keep composed. Hastings watched this scene with growing distress. She had expected a certain level of fear. After all, these were people whose nation had just suffered catastrophic defeat. But the absolute terror she witnessed went beyond rational apprehension. These women were not afraid of harsh treatment or imprisonment. They were afraid of imminent death. They believed with complete conviction that they were being processed not for detention, but for extermination. The realization struck Hastings with the force of revelation. These women had been taught to see Americans as monsters. And now, in defeat, they were confronting what they believed to be monsters holding total power over their lives. She made a decision in that moment that would define everything that followed. Moving to the front of the hall, she spoke through a translator, a Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd Regiment who had volunteered for occupation duty. Her words were simple, direct, and utterly contrary to the image these women had been conditioned to expect. "You are not prisoners," Hastings said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "You are not going to be harmed. You are safe now." The translator repeated her words in Japanese, but the women's faces showed no relief, only the kind of skepticism that comes from expecting lies before death. Hastings continued, knowing her words alone would prove nothing. "You will be processed, documented, and you will go home. You will return to your families. I promise you this." The promise hung in the air, impossible and absurd. These women had been raised in a culture where the word of authority carried absolute weight, where the emperor's voice could command millions to die without question. But they had also been fed years of propaganda about American barbarism, had been shown fabricated evidence of atrocities, had been psychologically prepared to expect the worst. Now an enemy officer was making promises that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some women simply stared, their minds unable to process information so contrary to their worldview. Others wept harder, uncertain whether these words represented mercy or mockery. Over the following days, as more groups of women were processed through the facility, Hastings and her small team of WAC officers worked to transform the environment from a detention center into something closer to a refugee camp. The distinction might have seemed semantic, but its practical implications were profound. The women were not locked in cells, but housed in dormitory-style rooms, with minimal restrictions on movement within the facility. They were provided with food, not the meager rations they might have expected as prisoners, but meals of substance and variety that many had not tasted in years. Rice, vegetables, canned meat, bread, even chocolate and coffee appeared on their trays. The sheer abundance was shocking to women who had survived on watery soup and radish leaves in the war's final months. The food became the first crack in the wall of their conditioning. Japanese wartime propaganda had insisted that America, despite its material wealth, was a nation in decline, decadent, weak, and running out of resources to sustain its military effort. The women had been told that American soldiers themselves were starving, that the enemy's industrial capacity was exhausted. Yet here, in defeat, they were being fed better than they had eaten during Japan's supposed triumphs. The symbolic weight of each meal was enormous. Every bite of white bread, every taste of real meat, every cup of hot coffee was evidence that they had been lied to. If the propaganda had been wrong about American scarcity, what else had been a lie? But food alone could not overcome years of psychological conditioning. The women remained deeply traumatized, flinching at sudden movements, speaking in whispers, watching the American guards with the wary vigilance of prey animals. Many still believed that the relative comfort they were experiencing was temporary, a cruel deception before the inevitable horror. Japanese military culture had stories of this too. Enemies who softened prisoners with kindness before the torture began, who made death more psychologically devastating by first offering false hope. The women waited for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when the masks would come off, and the true face of their captors would be revealed. Lieutenant Hastings understood that trust could not be commanded or reasoned into existence. It had to be demonstrated through consistent, patient action. She made herself a constant presence in the facility, not as a distant authority, but as a visible, approachable figure. She learned basic Japanese phrases, clumsy and poorly pronounced, but the effort itself carried meaning. She ensured that her guards treated the detainees with respect, immediately removing any soldier who showed contempt or aggression. She established a medical clinic where women could receive treatment for injuries and illnesses that had gone unaddressed during the war's chaos. She arranged for the delivery of personal items, combs, soap, clean clothing, things that had no strategic value but enormous psychological significance. Most importantly, she kept her promise. After processing and documentation were complete, women began to be released. In small groups at first, carefully screened and provided with transit papers, they were allowed to leave the facility and return to their homes. The first releases triggered panic among those who remained. Many assumed these women were being taken away for execution, that the release story was a cover for mass killings. But then something unprecedented happened. Some of the released women returned. They came back to the facility voluntarily, bringing messages for friends and family members still inside. They confirmed that they had indeed gone home, that they had been reunited with their families, that the American officer's promise had been true. The impact was seismic. Word spread through the remaining detainees like electricity through wire. The impossible was real. The enemy was keeping its word. Women who had spent weeks in rigid terror began, tentatively, to relax. Conversations became slightly louder. Eye contact was occasionally made with guards. A few women even smiled, brief, uncertain expressions, but smiles nonetheless. The psychological transformation was slow and uneven, marked by setbacks and renewed fears whenever rumors circulated or misunderstandings occurred. But the fundamental trajectory was irreversible. These women were not being exterminated. They were not being enslaved. They were being documented and released, just as the American lieutenant had promised. One evening in late September, Hastings was making her routine rounds through the facility when she encountered a young woman sitting alone in one of the dormitory common areas. The woman, barely 20 years old, with the posture of someone carrying an invisible weight, was holding a small notebook, writing by the dim light of a single bulb. Hastings had noticed her before. She was one of the quieter detainees, someone who kept to herself and participated minimally in the tentative social rebuilding happening among the women. Through the translator, Hastings asked what she was writing. The young woman hesitated, then explained in halting Japanese that she was trying to record what had happened, to create some account of these weeks that she could keep, so that in the future she could remember and understand what she had experienced. The conversation that followed, conducted haltingly through the translator and broken by long silences, revealed the depth of the psychological transformation occurring within the facility. The young woman, her name was Keiko, had worked in a Tokyo factory producing electrical components for military aircraft. She had been a university student before the war, studying literature with dreams of becoming a teacher. When the factory mobilization orders came, she had no choice but to comply. She had spent 14 months in the factory, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, living in cramped dormitories, eating increasingly meager rations, all while being told that her sacrifice was necessary for Japan's divine victory. When surrender came, she had been certain her life was over. She had written a final letter to her parents, hidden it in her clothing, and reported for processing, convinced she would be dead within days. Now, more than a month later, she was alive, well-fed, and scheduled for release the following week. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that she struggled to integrate the experience into any coherent understanding of reality. "We were taught that Americans were devils," she said through the translator, her voice quiet but steady. "We were shown pictures, told stories, made to believe that surrender meant death worse than any honorable suicide. I believed this completely. I knew it to be true the way I knew the sun would rise. And now," she gestured helplessly at the room, at the clean bedding, at the food tray that still held uneaten bread from dinner. "Now I do not know what to believe about anything." Hastings listened, recognizing in Keiko's words the broader crisis of belief afflicting not just the detainees, but perhaps all of Japan. An entire nation had been taught a mythology of divine exceptionalism, inevitable triumph, and enemy barbarism. That mythology had been shattered not through military defeat alone, but through the simple, persistent reality of humane treatment in the face of absolute vulnerability. The detainees had expected hell and encountered mere bureaucracy mixed with unexpected kindness. This dissonance was as destabilizing as any military loss, because it undermined the entire framework through which they understood the world. "I cannot tell you what to believe," Hastings replied through the translator. "I can only tell you that we are people, just as you are people. We have mothers and sisters and daughters, just as you do. We want to go home, just as you do. The war is over, and we are all trying to figure out how to live in whatever comes next." It was not a philosophical statement or a political speech. It was simply the truth as Hastings understood it, a truth whose very ordinariness was revolutionary in its implications. The notebooks that Keiko and several other detainees kept during their time at the facility would later provide historians with invaluable primary source accounts of this period. These writings, discovered decades later in family archives and museum collections, reveal the intense psychological journey these women experienced. Early entries are marked by despair, resignation, and fatalistic observations about their impending deaths. Later entries show confusion, tentative hope, and eventually a kind of stunned gratitude mixed with anger at having been so thoroughly deceived by their own government. One woman wrote, "They feed us 3 times each day. Real food, not the watery nothing we had before. Why did our leaders tell us they were starving? Why did they lie about everything?" The question of lies became central to the detainees' experience. As their fear of immediate death receded, it was replaced by a deeper, more existential crisis, the recognition that they had been systematically deceived. The abundance of American supplies, the professional conduct of the occupation forces, the basic humanity of the guards, all of this contradicted the narrative they had been fed for years. If the propaganda had lied about American intentions, what else had been false? Had the war itself been just? Had Japan's imperial conquests been defensive necessities or aggressive invasions? Had the millions of deaths been meaningful sacrifices or pointless waste? These questions had no easy answers, and many women would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with them. The WAC officers managing the facility became unwitting ambassadors for a different conception of power and authority. Lieutenant Hastings and her team exercised control not through violence or intimidation, but through structure, consistency, and a kind of maternalistic pragmatism. They enforced rules about hygiene, schedule, and behavior, but did so with explanation rather than arbitrary command. When conflicts arose among detainees inevitable, in any population living under stress, the WAC officers mediated rather than simply imposing punishment. This approach was not primarily ideological. Hastings and her colleagues were simply applying the management principles they had learned in their own military training. But to women raised in Japan's rigidly hierarchical society, where authority was absolute and explanation was considered unnecessary, this style of leadership was foreign and revealing. One incident in particular crystallized the cultural gap and its implications. A group of younger detainees had been caught hoarding bread from meals, hiding it in their clothing and bedding. When confronted, they initially refused to explain, expecting punishment without trial. Hastings, however, insisted on understanding the behavior before addressing it. Through patient questioning, it emerged that the women were not hoarding food out of greed, but out of lingering fear that the abundance was temporary, that at any moment, the supplies would cease and they would be left to starve. They were acting on survival instincts developed during years of deprivation. Rather than punishing them, Hastings responded by arranging a tour of the facility's supply depot, allowing the women to see the stockpiles of food waiting to be distributed. She explained the logistic system that ensured regular resupply. She made the infrastructure of abundance visible and comprehensible. The bread hoarding stopped immediately. But more significantly, word of the incident spread through the facility. And with it, a profound realization. The Americans operated on principles that prioritized understanding over punishment, explanation over blind obedience. This was not weakness or indecision. The facility remained orderly and rules were still enforced. But the philosophical foundation was different. Authority was expected to justify itself, to demonstrate reason for its commands. This principle, so fundamental to American democratic culture that Hastings barely thought about it consciously, was revolutionary to women raised under imperial, military authoritarianism. As September turned to October, and the facility's population steadily declined through continuing releases, a curious social phenomenon emerged. Some women, having been cleared for release, chose to stay for a few extra days. They were not prevented from leaving, the doors were open, transit papers were provided, but they lingered. They helped newer arrivals adjust, translated the facility's routines, provided reassurance to women still consumed by fear. They became, in effect, voluntary staff members bridging the cultural and linguistic gap between the American administration and the Japanese detainees. This behavior baffled some of the younger American soldiers who could not understand why anyone would voluntarily remain in detention. But Hastings recognized it for what it was, a tentative embrace of agency. A first experimental step toward choosing one's own actions rather than simply obeying orders or succumbing to fear. Among these informal helpers was Keiko, the young former university student. Having been cleared for release in late September, she had delayed her departure by 2 weeks, spending her days assisting the WAC medical staff with translation and helping traumatized new arrivals adjust to the facility. When Hastings finally asked her why she stayed, Keiko's answer was both simple and profound. "I am learning," she said. "Learning about things I never knew existed. Learning that the world is different than what I was taught. When I go home, I will carry this knowledge with me. But I am not yet ready. I need more time to understand." What Keiko was describing, though she lacked the vocabulary to articulate it fully, was a process of ideological deprogramming and reconstruction. She had been raised in a totalitarian system that provided absolute answers to all questions of meaning, morality, and truth. That system had collapsed, revealing its answers to be lies. Now she was encountering a different system, not one that provided new absolute answers, but one that operated on principles of pragmatism, individual dignity, and justified authority. This transition was not automatic or easy. It required unlearning years of conditioning, developing new frameworks for understanding power and obligation, and building trust in institutions and individuals that had recently been enemies. The women who passed through the Yokohama facility were not unique in experiencing this transformation. Across occupied Japan, in dozens of processing centers, refugee camps, and administrative facilities, similar encounters were occurring between American occupation personnel and Japanese civilians. The outcomes varied dramatically based on the personalities involved, the resources available, and the specific circumstances of each location. Some facilities were harsh and punitive, run by officers who saw Japanese civilians as complicit in their military's atrocities and deserving of minimal consideration. Others were chaotic and negligent, where bureaucratic indifference created suffering through incompetence rather than malice. But in places like Yokohama, where individuals like Lieutenant Hastings combined authority with empathy, something more significant emerged. A practical demonstration that the war's ideological differences were not unbridgeable, that former enemies could interact as human beings rather than caricatures. The symbolic importance of the WAC officers in this process cannot be overstated. Had the detainees' primary contact been with male soldiers, the psychological dynamic would have been fundamentally different, weighted with additional layers of gender-based vulnerability and threat. But the presence of uniformed American women in positions of authority created a different equation. These were not potential predators, but potential protectors. They exercised power but did not embody physical menace. They represented American military might, but in a form that could be approached, questioned, even tentatively trusted. For many detainees, Lieutenant Hastings and her colleagues were the first Americans they had ever interacted with as individuals rather than abstractions. The fact that these first encounters were with women who treated them with basic decency had implications that rippled far beyond the facility's barbed wire perimeter. By late October 1945, the Yokohama facility was winding down its operations. The vast majority of detainees had been processed and released. Those who remained were mostly women awaiting family contacts or dealing with complex documentation issues. The crisis atmosphere of August and early September had given way to something closer to routine. The women moved through the facility with relative ease, helped with cleaning and cooking tasks, played simple card games in the common areas during evening hours. It no longer resembled a detention center so much as a temporary dormitory for displaced persons, which, in truth, was all it had ever really been. On October 28th, Lieutenant Hastings oversaw the release of the last major group of detainees. Among them was Keiko, finally departing to return to her family in Tokyo. Before leaving, she presented Hastings with her notebook, the one in which she had been recording her experiences. Through the translator, she explained that she wanted the American officer to have it, to understand what her actions had meant to those who had been terrified and vulnerable. Hastings accepted the gift, though she could not read the Japanese text. Years later, after the notebook had been translated, she would weep reading Keiko's account of her own transformation from terrified detainee expecting death to young woman rediscovering the possibility of hope. The Yokohama facility officially closed in November 1945, having processed more than 2,000 women over its 3-month operation. Lieutenant Hastings remained in Japan through the occupation's early years, eventually taking on roles in the reconstruction of Japanese women's education systems. She would later reflect that her time running the detainee facility was the most challenging and meaningful work of her military service. We were dealing with people whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered, she wrote in a letter to her sister in 1946. They had been taught to see us as monsters, and when they discovered we were merely human, it forced them to question everything else they had been taught. I do not know what Japan will become in the years ahead, but I hope that some of those women will remember that enemies can choose to be decent to one another. and that this choice matters more than any ideology. The historical record of female detainee processing in occupied Japan remains fragmentary and understudied. Unlike the extensively documented male POW camps or the high-profile war crimes trials, the experiences of women caught in the post-surrender chaos have received relatively little attention from historians. Military records focus on logistics and numbers: how many processed, how quickly released, at what cost. Personal accounts are rare, scattered across family archives and private collections, difficult to access and often never translated. But from the documents that do exist, a picture emerges of a system that, at its best, managed to treat vulnerable people with unexpected humanity during a period of historical trauma. The women who passed through facilities like Yokohama returned to a Japan that was itself undergoing radical transformation. The occupation forces were imposing democratic reforms, dismantling the imperial military apparatus, purging militarists from positions of authority, and rewriting the nation's constitution. Women gained the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. Labor laws were reformed to provide protections for workers. Education systems were restructured to emphasize critical thinking over rote obedience. These macro-level reforms created the structural foundation for a new society. But for the changes to take root psychologically, people needed more than new laws and institutions. They needed evidence that the principles underlying these reforms were real and trustworthy. For the women who had experienced the Yokohama facility and places like it, that evidence was personal and undeniable. They had been vulnerable, had expected the worst, and had instead encountered a form of authority that operated on different principles than what they had known under militarism. The occupation was far from perfect. It was marked by cultural insensitivity, bureaucratic failures, and instances of abuse. But in specific moments, in specific places, individuals like Lieutenant Hastings demonstrated that power could be exercised with restraint and concern for dignity. These demonstrations mattered not because they were universal, but because they were real. They could not be dismissed as propaganda because they had been lived experiences. Keiko, the young woman who had kept a notebook during her detention, would eventually return to university and complete her literature degree. She became a teacher as she had dreamed, working in Tokyo public schools through the 1950s and 1960s. She married, had children, and lived to see Japan's transformation into a prosperous democracy. In the 1980s, as part of a historical documentation project on women's wartime experiences, she was interviewed about her time at the Yokohama facility. By then in her 60s, she reflected on how that experience had shaped her understanding of the world. I learned that the categories we create, friend and enemy, good and evil, us and them, these are not natural truths but choices we make. The American woman who ran that place could have treated us cruelly. We had been her enemies. We had worked to support the military that killed her countrymen. She had every justification for vengeance. But she chose differently. That choice taught me more about democracy than any textbook could. The recurring symbol throughout the experiences of female detainees was not a weapon or a political slogan, but something far more mundane: the daily bread that appeared on their meal trays. That bread, white and soft and abundant, represented everything the propaganda had insisted was impossible. It was evidence of American industrial capacity, proof that the enemy was not the exhausted, declining power they had been told to expect. But it was also evidence of a philosophical principle, that even in victory, even when holding total power over defeated enemies, resources would be used to sustain rather than destroy. The bread was not just food. It was a daily, tangible refutation of the lies they had been taught. Many women would later recall that bread with an emotional intensity that seemed disproportionate to outside observers. But those who had lived through years of deprivation, who had watched rations shrink month by month as the war ground toward its conclusion, who had felt the gnawing hollowness of chronic hunger while being told that sacrifice was glorious for them. The bread was revolutionary. It proved that abundance was possible, that suffering was not inevitable, that those in power could choose to share resources rather than hoard them. These were lessons that would stay with them for life, shaping how they raised their children, how they participated in rebuilding their nation, how they understood the relationship between citizen and state. Lieutenant Margaret Hastings returned to the United States in 1948, leaving behind a Japan that was already unrecognizable from the shattered nation she had first encountered in 1945. She resumed civilian life in Pennsylvania, eventually becoming a social worker specializing in refugee resettlement, work that drew directly on her experiences managing the Yokohama facility. She rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service, considering it simply a job she had been assigned and completed to the best of her ability. She did not see herself as having done anything extraordinary. When asked in later years why she had treated the detainees with such care, her answer was characteristically pragmatic. They were people in a terrible situation, through no real fault of their own. What else would I have done? That question, what else would I have done, reflects a worldview so fundamentally decent that it could not imagine cruelty as a viable option. Hastings operated from a moral framework where human dignity was axiomatic, where authority carried an obligation to those under its power, where the distinction between friend and enemy did not override basic ethical responsibilities. This framework was not unique to her. It was shared by many American military personnel who served in occupation roles, but neither was it universal. Other officers made different choices, created different environments, left different legacies. The variability itself is significant, demonstrating that individual character and decision-making mattered even within the structures of military hierarchy in wartime. Authority. The long-term impact of experiences like those at Yokohama is impossible to quantify precisely but undeniable in its existence. The women who passed through such facilities became mothers, teachers, workers, and citizens in post-war Japan. They carried with them memories of how they had been treated during their most vulnerable moment. Those memories informed how they thought about authority, how they evaluated government promises, how they understood international relations. When Japan and the United States became Cold War allies, when Japanese and American companies began forming partnerships, when cultural exchange programs brought former enemies into collaboration, all of this was made psychologically possible by the groundwork laid in places like the Yokohama facility, where former enemies had encountered each other as human beings. The story of Japanese women detained and released by American occupation forces is not a story of American exceptionalism or moral superiority. The occupation of Japan included many dark chapters, cases of sexual violence by occupying soldiers, economic exploitation, cultural arrogance, and the imposition of reforms without adequate understanding of local contexts. The treatment of female detainees at Yokohama was not representative of universal American virtue, but rather of what became possible when individuals of basic decency were placed in positions of authority and chose to exercise that authority humanely. It was exceptional, not because it was uniquely American, but because it was exceptional, a bright thread in a tapestry that also included darker colors. What makes this story historically significant is not its exceptionalism, but its ordinariness. Lieutenant Hastings did not set out to be heroic. The WAC officers under her command were not pursuing some grand ideological mission. They were simply trying to do their jobs competently while treating the people under their authority with basic respect. The fact that such ordinary decency had such profound impact reveals the depths of fear and indoctrination that the Japanese women had suffered under militarism. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to expect inhumanity that simple humanity became revolutionary. In the autumn of 1945, as the maple leaves turned red across Yokohama and the first cool winds signaled the approaching winter, women who had expected to die instead boarded trucks that would take them home. They carried transit papers, small packages of provisions for their journeys, and memories that would shape the rest of their lives. They had entered the facility as true believers in the propaganda of militarist Japan, convinced that surrender meant extinction. They left as something else, witnesses to the possibility that former enemies could treat each other with dignity, that power could be exercised with restraint, that the world was more complex and less certain than any propaganda had ever suggested. The last entry in Keiko's notebook, written the night before her release, captures something of this transformation. The original Japanese is poetic and elusive, but in translation it reads, "Tomorrow I return to a world that no longer exists. The city is there, my family is there, but the meanings have changed. I have seen that what I believed was false, and I do not yet know what is true. But I know this. The American woman told me I was safe, and I did not believe her, and I was wrong not to believe. I will remember this. I will teach my children to question what they are told, to look for truth in actions rather than words, to remember that people can choose to be kind even when they have no obligation to be. This is what I learned behind the wire. This is what I will carry forward." The decades following the war would see Japan and America become not just allies, but deeply interconnected societies. Economic ties, security partnerships, cultural exchanges, and millions of individual relationships would bind the former enemies into a complex web of mutual interest and shared values. This transformation was made possible by many factors: strategic calculations during the Cold War, Japanese economic development, American political support, and evolving regional dynamics. But beneath these structural factors lay something more fundamental: a shared recognition former enemies could build something new together, that the hatreds of war need not be permanent, that people could choose reconciliation over revenge. That recognition was built in countless, small moments across the occupation years. It was built in the medical clinics where American doctors treated Japanese patients. It was built in the schools where American advisors worked alongside Japanese teachers. It was built in the markets where soldiers and civilians learned to communicate across language barriers. And it was built in places like the Yokohama facility, where Lieutenant Margaret Hastings looked at terrified women who had been taught to see her as a monster and said, simply and truthfully, "You're safe now." The power of those words lay not in their eloquence, but in their truth. They were a promise that was kept. They were evidence that the world could be different than propaganda had insisted. They were a small crack in the wall of totalitarian indoctrination, through which light could enter. For the women who heard those words and lived to see them validated, they became a touchstone, a memory that proved humanity could persist even in the darkest times. That individuals could choose decency even when systems provided no incentive for it. That the categorical divisions of war could give way to the recognition of shared humanity. History is made in grand gestures and vast movements, in battles and treaties and the rise and fall of nations. But it is also made in moments like these: a young woman trembling with fear, a foreign officer speaking words of reassurance, a promise kept, a bread ration that proved propaganda false, a notebook recording the transformation of belief. These moments do not always make it into the history books. They are too small, too personal, too easily dismissed as anecdotes rather than evidence. But they matter. They shape how people understand their world, how they pass values to the next generation, how they imagine what is possible. In the end, the story of the Japanese women who passed through the Yokohama facility is a story about the collapse and reconstruction of belief. They had believed in the propaganda of militarism, in Japan's divine mission, in American barbarism. Those beliefs were shattered by defeat and by the undeniable evidence of their own experiences. What replaced those beliefs was not a new certainty, but a more mature understanding that the world is complex, that propaganda lies, that individuals matter, that kindness is a choice that even enemies can make. This understanding, shared by thousands of women who lived through similar experiences across occupied Japan, became part of the foundation on which a new society could be built. 70 years later, when historians examine the occupation of Japan and seek to understand how two nations that fought with such ferocity became such close allies, they must look beyond the treaties and the economic data and the strategic calculations. They must look to the human encounters, the individual choices, the moments when people could have chosen cruelty and chose compassion instead. They must look to the bread that appeared on the trays, the promises that were kept, the voices that said, "You're safe now," and meant it. These are the materials from which reconciliation is built. These are the threads from which new futures are woven. These are the truths that endure when propaganda fades and ideology fails. The women walked out through the gates, into the uncertain future of a defeated nation struggling to reimagine itself. Behind them, the barbed wire and guard towers remained, but already they were being dismantled, converted, repurposed for a peacetime that was still being invented day by day. Ahead of them lay the hard work of reconstruction, not just of cities and economies, but of meaning and belief and trust. They carried with them memories of fear and hunger and indoctrination, but also memories of unexpected kindness, of promises kept, of bread that was real and abundant and shared. And in those memories lay the seeds of something that propaganda could never create, but that human decency could cultivate: hope,